Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, 1962. A quiet town shaken by a crime so brutal that it still lingers in the shadows of history. Christine Mapps and her young daughter Julia were found murdered in their home, their lives stolen in an act of unimaginable violence. But the most haunting part of this case? Christine's husband, Edward Mapps, vanished that same day and has never been seen again. Did he flee justice, or was he another victim lost to time? This is the story of the Mapps family murders. Hello friends, my name is Marcia, and this is Midwest Murders. In the early 1960s, Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania was a small but thriving town nestled in the Pocono Mountains. While it had long been a quiet town centered around local businesses, farming, and tourism, the post-war economic boom had brought modernization. New highways, including the nearby Interstate 80, which was under construction at the time, promised easier access to major cities like New York and Philadelphia. This development made the Poconos a growing destination for vacationers, particularly from urban areas looking for a mountain retreat. Life in Stroudsburg in the early 60s was still rooted in traditional American values. Families gathered around black and white televisions, listened to Elvis Presley and the Four Seasons on the radio, and shopped at locally owned stores along Main Street. The Cold War was a looming presence, with air raid drills and fallout shelter signs dotting the landscape. Edward Howard Mapps, age 38, was an artist-sculptor described as unconventional, often showing up in town barefoot and casually dressed. He had inherited money from his late father and had invested wisely, allowing him to live on the income from those investments and earnings from selling his paintings and sculptures. Well educated with a variety of interests, he enjoyed searching for fossils and other relics. Prior to his marriage to his wife Christine, who was 16 years his junior, he led a nomadic lifestyle, often staying with friends for months at a time. He was known to be a devoted father and a kind and loyal friend. He and Christine had one child, 4-month-old Julia Lewis, whom he adored. They had recently moved into a home at 510 Sarah Street in Stroudsburg, which they were remodeling. At 8:30 p.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1962, Ed and Christine, with baby Julia in tow, dropped in at the home of a neighbor, Margaret Muchler, at 509 Thomas Street, to drop off a fresh-baked apple pie. After visiting a few minutes, the couple left at about 9:10 p.m. Mrs. Muchler would later tell police there did not seem to be any problem between the couple, although Edward did seem a little anxious to leave. Later that evening, Mrs. May Young, who owned a rooming house next door to the Mapps family, smelled smoke. She stepped out on her porch to investigate and saw what she thought were flames in the Mapps living room. She called police at 10:45 p.m. Police and firefighters arrived on the scene almost immediately to find all the doors and windows locked. After forcing entry through the back door, fire personnel found the gas jets on the stove had been turned on and the oven set to 450 degrees. There was little fire damage but extremely heavy smoke. Crawling on their hands and knees through the thick black smoke, firefighters discovered Christine on the floor of the dining room. She was still alive. 10 feet away they found baby Julia lying on a bench. Both had suffered second and third-degree burns. Firefighters continued their search for Edward, but he could not be located. After administering oxygen to Christine on the back porch, she was transported to Monroe County General Hospital, where she would die several hours later. Unfortunately, baby Julia was dead on arrival. Dr. Harvey Pullen performed the autopsies and determined that Christine had died of a fractured skull. She had been hit 6 times by a blunt instrument. Baby Julia died of smoke inhalation. Investigators determined that several fires had been deliberately set to cover up the attack on Christine, with 6 to 7 small fires being started in the attic, 2 on the first floor, and a larger one in the basement. It was believed that fires started about 40 minutes before firefighters were called. It also appeared that Christine had just finished changing Julia's diaper when she was attacked. The couple's 2 cars were untouched in the driveway, with the keys in the ignition. As police began interviewing neighbors and those who knew the couple, a single picture emerged. This was a couple who, by all accounts, were devoted to each other and their daughter, and were often seen walking arm in arm with never a harsh word said between them. While Edward was considered eccentric and a little odd, he was also unanimously called gentle and caring. Police immediately put out an all-points bulletin trying to locate Edward, who was described as wearing dungarees and open sandals when he was last seen. At 5'6", husky, with a ruddy complexion and clean-shaven, with wavy graying hair, he was easily identifiable. Police focused on Monroe and Pike counties, as well as New Jersey and New York City, where Ed used to live. Within several hours of the fire, a warrant for his arrest for murder was filed. Edward has not been seen since. Police officially verified 2 calls that Edward made after he disappeared. One to a female artist the day after the fire where he supposedly told her, "You're next," and another call made the following day to a male artist friend where they discussed art. Private funeral services for Christine and Julia were held at the Dunkelberger Westbrook Funeral Home in Stroudsburg, officiated by the Reverend Thomas Shoesmith. They were laid to rest together in a single gray coffin in the Dutch Reformed Cemetery in Bushkill. In September 1962, the contents of the Mapps family home were auctioned off to settle Christine's estate. Edward, who had been placed on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, was taken off the list in 1967 and declared legally dead in 1971. It does not appear the police made any attempt to develop further suspects. They immediately focused on Edward, and when he was declared legally dead, they closed the case. In later years, there's been speculation that perhaps Christine's father may have been involved. It was widely known that he did not care for Edward and he was unhappy about the marriage. He was also known to have a temper and occasionally get violent. After their marriage in 1960, Ed and Christine lived with her parents at 507 Thomas Avenue until her father ordered them to leave. They lived briefly in an apartment before buying the home on Sarah Street. While the Mapps home no longer stands, it's important to note that at the time of the murders, Christine's family home was just across a small back alley from the home she shared with Edward. The houses were basically back to back. Looking at this case through the lens of history, it's important to remember that police techniques and investigative standards in the 1960s were vastly different from today. But even with that in mind, there are aspects of this case that don't sit right with me. Investigators theorized that Edward snapped under the pressures of marriage, fatherhood, and financial strain, brutally attacking his wife and leaving his daughter to die. But there's no evidence to support that. In fact, every witness statement paints Edward as a devoted husband and father. And if he planned to run, why not take one of the cars? And why not access his trust fund, worth the equivalent of about $155,000 today, which was left untouched and later distributed to his siblings? That money could have made disappearing a whole lot easier. Then there were the phone calls. If Edward had just murdered his family, why would he be making cryptic calls to other artists, threatening one while casually discussing art with the other? There's nothing in his background to suggest he was violent, yet these calls were accepted as proof of his survival based solely on the recipients claiming to recognize Edward's voice. I believe the more likely scenario is that someone else attacked Christine and abducted Edward. His anxiousness to leave Margaret Muchler's house may suggest he was expecting someone at home that evening, someone he didn't perceive as a threat. Christine, too, seemed at ease, tending to Julia when she was attacked. What about the fires? They were small and seemingly ineffective, starved of oxygen in the closed-up house. No accelerants were found, and they only flared up when firefighters forced entry. Were they meant to destroy evidence, or simply to draw attention to the crime scene? And that brings us to the biggest mystery. Why take Edward? He was known for wandering around the woods and spending time around town. Could he have seen or heard something he wasn't supposed to? If his disappearance was about money, why was his trust fund untouched? More than 60 years later, we still don't have the answers. But one thing is certain. This case is far from simple, and the truth, whatever it may be, remains buried in the past. If you have any thoughts, theories, or comments about this case, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and may the truth reveal itself in the shadows.